Ojibwe, or otherwise known as Chippewa tribes. They are actually the newcomers as far as the Native Americans are concerned for this area. In fact, for most of the history, this area, indeed all of northern Wisconsin, was primarily populated by the Dakota, who are also known as the Santee or Eastern Sioux. Now, it's out of favor and out of political correctness to use the term Sioux these days, and part of it is because the word was a derogatory word meaning snake. But also interesting, it was not the European immigrants who gave the Sioux that name, it was their rivals, the Ojibwe, who dubbed them the snakes. Now, the Ojibwe are believed to have originated in the Hudson Bay area. Their oral history tradition indicates that they were founded near a huge body of water, and today most people believe that it was the Hudson Bay rather than the mouth of the St. Lawrence Seaway on the Atlantic Ocean. In about the 14th century, harsh climate changes in the region made things harsher in that area, and it is believed that that is what prompted the migration of the Ojibwe people. So it wasn't until about the time Columbus was discovering America, thinking he'd found the ticket to China, but as Columbus was discovering America, that was when the Ojibwe first arrived at the eastern end of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Now, their arrival there, without ceding any of the land they had previously occupied, had started to displace a number of resident tribes. Another surprise for most people, hooray for Hollywood, is that the Cheyenne and Arapaho people were natives of the south shore of Lake Superior. And yet, as the Ojibwe pushed westward, and the Dakota on this end were not willing to cede any land, through their own individual wars and battles, the Arapaho and Cheyenne ended up being displaced all the way until they got to Colorado. And this is where the Hollywood image of those tribes tends to be fixed in the American psyche. Also, the movement of the Ojibwe drove the Menominee southward in Wisconsin, and they formed an alliance with the Winnebago Nation, which today we refer to as the Ho-Chunk Nation. And this movement was also a beginning of the drive by the Ojibwe that didn't end until 1780, when the Dakota had ultimately been driven out of Michigan, out of northern Wisconsin, out of Minnesota, in fact, pushed into North Dakota quite a ways. What happened was when the French explorers and missionaries first arrived on Lake Superior in 1623, remember this is only a year after the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, the Ojibwe were primarily concentrated on the eastern half of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But because the trade worked so well and the French and the Ojibwe got along so well, they became the primary trading partners with the French, and thus the Ojibwe language became the unofficial trading language of the northern Great Lakes. Now this trade, which included modern weapons, gave the Ojibwe wealth and power that had not been anticipated. And the alliance with the French, with the Ojibwe, and involved two major events that helped shape our area. First, the Iroquois, who had a similar arrangement with the Dutch as far as being exclusive trading partners with fur, really wanted the Lake Superior trade as well. And so during the 1650s, Iroquois war parties roamed around Wisconsin trying to conquer these areas and get an inroad. As a result of that, they drove the Ottawa tribes north to the Chequamegon area and to the Keweenaw Peninsula. Secondly, what that trade fueled, it fueled the western movement of the Ojibwe at a much more rapid pace. The wealth and the weapons provided made it easier for the Ojibwe to conquer new territories in the west. By the time Radisson and Groseilliers arrived at the mouth of the Montreal River in 1658, by the way, they were ignoring a temporary ban on fur trading in Lake Superior when they did do that. The French government had ordered a halt on the fur trading because of the wars of the native peoples going on. But at that time, our area was a mixture of tribes with villages dispersed among one another. The Ojibwe had established their village at La Pointe, out on Madeline Island, and were living peacefully with their close allies, the Ottawa. Also present were the Wyandot and a few Potawatomi and Kickapoo bands. And the Dakota were prominent along the south shore of Lake Superior, and they were the inhabitants at Lac Courte Oreille and Lac de Flambeau. And 7 years after Radisson and Groseilliers, the Jesuit Claude Jean Allouez arrived in the area mission of Saint Esprit over on the Chequamegon Bay. He was joined 3 years later by Father Jacques Marquette, and he was appalled. Father Marquette was appalled to find the starvation, the epidemics, and the constant warfare taking place by the native people. So by the end of the first year here, Father Marquette had negotiated a peace, and he had convinced the Ottawa and the Wyandot to move their tribes and relocate to the Mackinac area. Ultimately, by the time Father Marquette's work was done, there were only the Ojibwe and the Dakota left facing each other in this immediate vicinity. Then in 1678, Daniel Duluth, who Duluth was named after, arrived at Sault Ste. Marie. He spent 2 years negotiating. The problem was, as the French saw it, they weren't really worried how the natives were fighting, except that it was really cutting into the fur trade, primarily the beaver pelts, which were all the rage throughout France. And so the idea of hammering out a peace accord was something important to their economic interest. And so he worked on that, and a peace accord was developed after 2 years between the Dakota and the Ojibwe, and it was accepted by most of the Ojibwe, with the notable exception of those living on the Keweenaw Peninsula. That band really kind of rejected it. But then for about 60 years, there was relative peace between the Dakota and the Ojibwe. But in the late 1740s, starting from the stronghold at La Pointe and Chequamegon Bay, the Ojibwe's Pillager Band launched their offensive. They took the old Flambeau Trail, or we refer to it as the old Flambeau Trail. The Flambeau Trail was one that came from Madeline Island to the mouth of the Montreal River. Generally, huge lake canoes were used, and then usually there was portaging and foot traffic then between this end, coming across, right across this area, working their way down to Lac de Flambeau. And the Ojibwe moved down and drove the Dakota out of first Lac de Flambeau and then La Coudray, and continued their westward thrust until they had pushed the Dakota well into North Dakota. And at that point, they made the Ojibwe one of the largest Native American empires on the North American continent. The Ojibwe ruled lands in Canada on both sides of Lake Huron and Lake Superior, a significant portion of the lower peninsula of Michigan, the entire upper peninsula, the northern two-thirds just about of Wisconsin, similar amount of Minnesota, and eastern North Dakota. Now, we don't hear a lot about that and don't learn a lot about that in school, because as European immigration came place, most of the western drive for America was south of here. The railroads that were built, the transcontinental lines, the westward push, was south of here. And then, of course, you have an international line, European-made line of the United States to Canada. So very little was identified about that, and it went relatively unnoticed. But that is essentially how it happened. As treaties were hammered out, many of us remember some of the issues that surrounded that. We had, initially, the Ojibwe were ceded every bit of land that they claimed. All that was reserved out was space for a fort and a fur trading company at Sault Ste. Marie on the eastern end of the Upper Peninsula. Lo and behold, minerals were found as we moved into the 19th century. And so different treaties were forced into them. The Ojibwe never really had significant confrontation with European settlers in the area. The different treaties were hammered out from time to time. In fact, as I get into genealogy, my third cousin 6 times removed was Zachary Taylor, and he signed the order to round up all the Ojibwe and relocate them to Kansas. But 2 years into office, he had some bad cherries on a particularly hot, sweltering 4th of July in Washington, and he dropped dead 6 days later. So Millard Fillmore stepped in, and he repealed the order that would have relocated all of the Ojibwe, and shortly after that, the final treaty leaving the fishing and game rights in place, but then restricting them, their residence to specific reservations were established. So how did I get here, and where did we come from? One of the things I'll touch on briefly, because we're running a little long with all the information we were trying to pack in today. Some of you have noticed that I've got a series of medals on. Genealogy is one of my passions. Now, most of the folks here, Brian, Paul, the folks from the State Historical Society, come to you with a scholarly background in history. I didn't do a lot of history in school. It wasn't until I started getting hooked on genealogy and following the family tree that all of these things started really gelling for me. And subsequently, for younger people in the family, my nephews and nieces, it's all of a sudden there's been some new excitement as they've found interesting histories or interesting aspects of how our family history relate to things they learn about in school. It's made it more vital and more alive. I've had 6 lines documented on my mother's side to the Mayflower. I've had lines to the Sons of the American Revolution. And in fact, my 5th great grandfather came here from Wales and promptly went to war against the Crown and spent that famous winter at Valley Forge with George Washington. The Society of the War of 1812, and then Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. Here's a plug for the State Historical Society. They have a very good search engine on the website. And I do have that. One more of the handout sheets that is up here are a list of genealogical resources where you can go online and find free information and free search engines. The State Historical Society has the roster of Wisconsin volunteers from the War of Rebellion in 1861 to 1865. And that was where I found my 4th great grandfather, Jerome Naylor, listed as a member of the cavalry from the Wisconsin Volunteers. And from finding that information, I was able to write and send a small fee to the National Archives, and I obtained his pension file, which was a wealth of genealogical information because I found out who his second wife was, the family name of his first wife, which was a stumbling block in my genealogical research, a whole list of children he had with the second wife and where they were, marriages, remarriages were recorded, the fact that he had sustained injuries falling off his mount at one point and had a saber slash across his face from another time. All kinds of rich details are available in this type of material. And this is what made it rich. My family now 3/4 of my family came from Poland at one point or another and came pretty much directly here. And I'm still working on getting to that area. But on my mother's side, they started from the Mayflower and at different migrations at different times and ended up pretty much in upstate New York, Washington County, which was on the upper Hudson River. When Wisconsin was becoming a state, Wisconsin started advertising in New York as well as in Europe, come out west, we need people to populate this state, and they were promoting Wisconsin as a place to live. At that time, Horace Greeley was also writing Go West, Young Man, which he was repeating from somebody else, but he gets the credit. But Horace Greeley was also known to my 3rd great grandfather, and Horace Greeley's brother, who my 3rd great grandfather referred to as Grudy, was a town clerk in upstate Vermont where there was a mill that Chancellor Butler Walsh, my 3rd great grandfather, operated. So he was married to a Sturtevant, and they rounded up a number of their brothers and sisters who were married or had maybe even had some children. The Erie Canal had also just been widened. And you'll find a lot of immigration into Wisconsin relates to the widening of the Erie Canal and the advertising Wisconsin was running in New York State in that era. And you'll find a lot of folks here have their roots that follow that pattern. An interesting note about the Erie Canal. How many of you have heard the song or remember back in grade school doing a Western play where you sang, "Buffalo Gals, Won't You Come Out Tonight"? That song was not a cowboy song, and the Buffalo Gals were just the same as the Hurley Gals. Your last stop before entering Lake Erie at the end of the Erie Canal was Buffalo. And along the canals, there were buildings built up, and the Buffalo Gals were upstairs on the 2nd floor windows, waving to the guys headed for the frontier, or saluting the guys coming in from the frontier who hadn't seen a woman in maybe a year or two. And so when the Buffalo Gals coming out tonight and dancing under the silver moon were just like the Hurley Gals who took care of the miners and the lumberjacks in the early days. And by the way, in those days, that was a legal profession and had a modicum of respect. There was still a good deal of disdain, and the preachers would be upset about it, but generally speaking, that was a legal profession in that era. And so my family ended up coming up, initially entering into the Fox Valley, and working their way up to Wapaka. After they had a foundry that burned to the ground and they lost everything, they moved up into the western end of Shawano County, adjacent to Marathon County, homesteaded land when it was available to make homesteads, and started farming. And then a few moved north to Rhinelander, and then my great-grandmother ended up settling in Winchester, just in 10 miles from Manitowish Waters off of Highway 51. From there, she ended up being a single mom. Her 3rd husband left her immediately upon the birth of a 3rd daughter in a row. And so there she was. She had been widowed once, married and divorced. In fact, she's one of probably only 6 divorce records in Rhinelander for the year 1903, or 1901. 1903, she remarried, and then had the 3 daughters. So she ended up raising them alone. They came up to Hurley to go to school, where they worked for their room and board, and they went to the, I think it was Hurley High School then. It hadn't even been named the Lincoln High School yet. And they've told me tales of how it was, how despite the rowdy nature of Hurley, people were gentlemen, and they knew where the lines were drawn. I remember my grandaunt telling me distinctly how she would be walking to school in the morning, and there may be somebody passed out from the night's activities still on the street, and nobody would dare touch us, and we'd just step around them and go on, and nobody was ever molested. And so that was kind of how my folks came through. What I have here for you among the other materials, and make sure you pick up Brian's materials and a copy of the fundraising letter to get some ideas of how to approach your people. USGenWeb.org is a sensational free site on the internet to get hooked into genealogy. From there, I've got the page that takes you right to the United States map. You can click an individual state. From there, you can pick a county. You can start tracing things and find contact all over the world. I've interestingly found all kinds of long-lost relatives who have shared things with me. A distant cousin who's the end of her line of the family recently gave me the diary of my 3rd great-granduncle, which would have been her great-great-grandfather, that he kept from 1916 to 1920. He was a prominent person in the Methodist Church and in the Kentucky Conference and Tennessee, but he traveled to all the national conventions. Almost every bishop that ever attended has autographed that. He has his exchange of correspondence with Susan B. Anthony, who was his primary school teacher, and in fact my 4th great-grandparents spent the last 34 years of their life in the Anthony house that was built outside of Greenwich, New York, before they moved into more famous addresses. But they knew each other. That was part of it. And that's what makes history rich, as you start finding this, as you start connecting to, oh, there's a president that shares maybe a dram of DNA with you. It gets the kids in the family excited and helps bring people into history. And as a result of that, I started looking to the history here, identifying how my great-great-grandparents came from Poland and landed in Stevens Point. I found the paper where John Metelsky renounced his allegiance to Wilhelm, Emperor of Germany and King of Prussia. And then I found the deed where they bought their property, which is essentially all of downtown Montreal now, which was a farm, and they were up here in 1891 when we were still part of Ashland County. And so when you can start finding these interesting things that have a relationship, genealogy and history go so hand in hand, and in fact with the popularity of genealogy, I encourage most of you to see how you can fold that into what you do with your different historical societies, because it's one good way to get people excited about local history by finding where their parents and grandparents fit in. And it's also a way to find people who come back to the area to visit their roots, to get them in as visitors and potential donors for your facility. So I have this list. It includes the